170 webinars so far, and we have been covering almost all spectrum of issues, socioeconomics, as well as to some extent, diplomatic issues, cross-country geopolitics. We have also been covering, to some extent, issues that are important from the economics angle, but are into sociology and anthropology. We have been very fortunate to have speakers like you, Nobel laureates, in the past, and we feel very blessed and privileged to have this opportunity to listen to you. To chair the session today, we have Dr. Surjit Bhalla, who's the former executive director of the International Monetary Fund, Washington, and former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. We have also invited a discussant, who's our advisor at EGROW, Professor Ashima Goyal. She is also the former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, as well as former member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the RBI. I must share with you, though Professor James Robinson, Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, is a Nobel laureate in economic sciences for 2024. I don't think he needs an introduction. We all have been reading his work, but I'll just share a few lines. He's an economist and political scientist. He has conducted, obviously, most influential research in the field of political and economic development and the relationships between political power and institutions and prosperity. His work explores the underlying causes of economic and political divergence between historically and today, and uses both the mathematical and quantitative methods of economics along with the case study, qualitative and fieldwork methodologies used in other social sciences. Professor Robinson, at EGROW, we have been making an attempt to have speakers come and speak to us on contemporary issues for India and for the rest of the world. As we are integrating, many of the things happening across the world influence us to a great extent. As you are aware, the tariff war obviously is impacting all of us. Your work on institutions and democracy and growth is obviously extremely important to us. Our Prime Minister has given a goal to the economists to think and talk about a developed India by 2047, which means 100 years of our independence. We are at 2,500 USD per capita income. In America, you are at around 85,000 USD. Even if we take the PPP, we have a long journey to undertake. China is competing rapidly, but China is not a democracy like you and we are. We economists many times wonder, will we be able to cover that gap? Not difficult. Korea from 1962-89 did fly at 8% growth. China did for 30 years at 10%. So we are hopeful and we think we can do it. But then obviously in all debates, the issue comes, democracy versus the Chinese model of the political system. So it was in that very context that we wanted you to come and speak to us about your influential research on democracy and growth. And that's how we were pursuing you to please come and share your thoughts. To chair the session today is Dr. Surjit Bhalla, and with this brief introduction from EGROW, I hand over the session to Dr. Bhalla.
Thank you, Charan. And I won't take too much time, but very welcome, Dr. Robinson. We all have been reading your work for decades. And so I'm really looking forward to your presentation, especially at this time when democracy is in stress in the world's oldest democracy. So would like to get some pointers some comments on that. And, over the years, there has been discussion and talk about the influence of the deep state, where the deep state is defined as rule by unelected officials, so non-democratic in that sense, that the decision-making is done by members of the deep state, and would really like to get some comments on that. The second aspect, on the impact of democracy on growth, where China is often, all the time, stated as the exception to engineering growth, and it's not a democracy. And the question I have is whether in the sample of economies which are broadly market economies, including those that are non-democracies, whether the exception of China holds, how much meaning does it hold for other countries embarking on the development path as well as growth. So, this is really look forward to your lecture, and I'll come back at the end of your lecture. Thank you very much, sir, for coming to EGROW.
Okay, great. I start talking now?
Yeah.
Okay, I have some slides. Can I share?
Professor, if you
Okay, here we
can.
are.
Otherwise, you have sent them to us and we can play them from here.
Yeah. Can you,
there you are.
Can you see those?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So thank you very much. Sorry, I'm a bit late. The time appeared as 9 on my phone. So let me thank you very much for inviting me. I'll start with a sort of narrow discussion, but it sounds like you have a lot of other questions perhaps in mind, so I could start talking about those sort of in an improvised way. So I think if you thought about what's the connection between democracy and prosperity, that comes in there's a bigger set of issues about what you need to have for prosperity in terms of what economic institutions you need to have, systems of property rights, or what types of public policies you need, healthcare, social insurance, education, and there's a sort of mapping between people's institutions and those outcomes, which is mediated by political institutions. After all, all of these things, infrastructure, order, etc., provided by politicians and bureaucrats. You just mentioned bureaucrats and the so-called deep state, and they may or may not have an incentive to act in the public good. So, maybe from a public finance perspective, there's some level of public goods which it would be desirable to provide in society, but whether or not they actually get provided is going to depend on the incentives of politicians and the bureaucrats who have to make the decisions to provide those things. And I think, so the way I've always thought about democracy, it's one set of institutions that provides a kind of particular set of incentives to politicians and bureaucrats. And we've tried to ask the question, in some sense, how good are those incentives to act in the collectively desirable way relative to incentives created by another set of institutions? And I think the complicated thing, about understanding the answer to that is there's a lot of mechanisms here. There's a lot of mechanisms which come into play. And there's also cultural specificities, I think, which I'll try to talk about. I think there's a big intuition as to why democracy might do a better job than non-democratic institutions. And if you think of democratic institutions as institutions that somehow spread political power in society, so they kind of increase the power of people in society relative to non-democratic institutions, where power tends to be concentrated more in some people's hands, whether it's President Putin and his advisors, whether it's the Communist Party in China or in North Korea, or, the so-called Chavistas in Venezuela. Political power is more narrowly concentrated than it would be in a democracy. And so, if you were going, and I think the intuition is that, well, ultimately, who has an interest in getting public goods provided? It's the mass of citizens, in some sense, and it's, to me, it's never been clear why elites. Oops, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the question is, in a non-democratic system where some narrow subset of society, let me call them elites, have political power, then you have to think through under what circumstances would they act in the public interest. And I think in my experience, and I'm going to start with a kind of ethnographic example from my own research, typically it's not in the interests of elites to provide public goods. They have to be forced to. Okay, so here's my example. I was doing fieldwork in Harare in southern Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe, in 2017, and I was driving back with some friends, from the restaurant, and here is a typical kind of scene at night in Harare. We turned a corner, and something weird happened. So it took me a few seconds to. There's something odd. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, and for a few seconds, and then I realized there's lights. So you see that it's dark and then it's light, and so I asked the taxi driver, like, what's going on here? And he said, this is the road to President Mugabe's residence, sir. So I think this is sort of how I think about it. Like, what you've had in Zimbabwe since 1980 is basically a one-party state under the ZANU-PF. There's been two leaders, President Mugabe, who passed away, and President Mnangagwa, who succeeded him. He was overthrown by the military, and then he passed away, and President Mnangagwa, who followed him. And Zimbabwe is about 15% poorer than it was in 1980 today. It's about the same level of income per capita as it was in the 1960s. So, this is a development disaster with a lot of very bad economic institutions. But it's ruled by a one-party state. And the one-party state doesn't really have the interest in providing public goods. Maybe it has the interest in providing, goods from which itself benefits, like streetlight to its house. But generally, that's not enough to help the average Zimbabwean. Okay, and the idea is just of democracy as well. If you're going to get streetlight for everybody in Harare, then somehow they have to have power. They have to be able to influence the process that generates streetlights. And in Zimbabwe, they don't. So they don't get anything. Okay, so, here's another example sticking on the theme of Zimbabwe. This is from our book, Why Nations Fail, about how President Mugabe, won the lottery. Okay, so we've looked at this question in different ways, in my research over the last 25 years, I suppose you could say. And most recently, in this empirical paper we have in the Journal of Political Economy with Daron Ashimoglu, Suresh Naidu, and Pascual Restrepo, we tried to look very systematically in a panel of countries at the average impact of democratizing on income per capita, and we tried to look at the channels, the mechanisms via which any impact on income per capita might work. And the very robust, I'm going to show you some figures. I'm not going to go into any of the kind of econometrics or even show you regression tables, but the very robust fact is that democracy is good for economic growth in this panel. But you could say it's modestly good, in the sense that what we find is transitioning from an autocracy to a democracy thought of as being, a dichotomous, you're either one or the other, which is very simplistic, and I'll start talking about that afterwards. Transitioning from an autocracy to a democracy is actually associated with an increase in income per capita of 20%. Okay, so and that works through, provision of public goods through, it works through capital accumulation, which you could say is connected to maybe improvement in the security of property rights or legal institutions, but more directly, education and health. So public goods that benefit everyone relative to elites. Democracy is also associated with greater political stability. So, you know, what's an example? So Gabon, for example, in Central Africa, Gabon just had arguably its first democratic election in its entire history. So Gabon was ruled by Omar Bongo. He was an autocrat. It was then ruled by Ali Bongo after he passed away. His son was overthrown by a military coup a couple of years ago. And now the leader of that military coup reinvented himself as a democratic politician and just got himself elected. Now, there's a lot of disputes about whether that election was free and fair, but imagine it was. What's the prediction of these results for Gabon? Well, income per capita would increase by 20%. Okay, so relative, you were just outlining, you know, the differences in world development relative to the difference between Gabon, you know, and the income per capita of the United States. A 20% increase is significant, but of course it's very small relative to the difference in income per capita between Gabon and the United States. So it's a positive effect, but it's very small relative to the income differences we see around the world. Okay, so here's just the sort of the event study figure at the bottom. You know, whoop, oh, okay, hold on, I don't know what happened there. At the bottom, it suddenly got very small. Hold on. Okay. At the bottom, you know, 0 is the event of a democratization. And you can see to the right, there's a sort of distinct, the black line, the solid black line tells you, you know, what the model predicts about the change in GDP per capita are following a democratization. And, you know, it takes some time to actually get towards 20%. Also, that's because there's kind of dynamics in the model and you have to let the dynamics play out. Okay, so that's the basic finding. You know, here's an attempt to kind of summarize around year 0, around democratization, what happens to other phenomena. You know, so for example, the black line is investment per capita. You know, there's some increase in that over time. Some things go down. The thick red line is child mortality. The dashed blue line is secondary education. Again, these are not massive changes. You know, you can see from the vertical axis that they might be positive. You know, there's some positive effects on, as I said, capital accumulation, education, riots and violent revolts go down. There's some evidence for increased tax revenue per capita also, which is sort of interesting because there's a big issue about, you know, what's the connection between democratization and state building more generally. But again, so there's some positive things here, but it's sort of modest. Okay, so that, you know, this is very robust. I think our evidence is very robust. So, you know, why is there a debate? What's the debate about? Well, I think the way I think about that is, you know, what we're estimating there is the average effect of, you know, democratizing. And there's enormous heterogeneity within democracies and within dictatorships, meaning I can classify all the countries in the world, you know, as social scientists want to do between I could put them into 2 bins, democratic, undemocratic, but obviously there's an enormous difference between, you know, the enormous difference between the autocratic regime in China, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, you know, or Russia, indeed. And there's huge differences in economic performance. So Venezuela, for example, is far, far poorer like Zimbabwe than it was 20 years ago. That's obviously not true about China. In fact, the opposite is completely true. So there's enormous differences between autocracies, but there's also enormous differences between democracies as well. So I think, for example, you know, and this has been the experience in Latin America, you know, since all the democratizations in the 1990s, 1980s and 1990s in Latin America and Central America, is that the type of democracy that emerged was very clientelistic. So this was in a context with weak state institutions, very clientelistic, where people engaged in vote buying, patronage, and that turns out not to generate a lot of public goods. So if you have democratization, you may spread political power more evenly, but if the way that power is kind of organized is through patron-client relationships, through clientelism, then that's focused on the exchange of political support for private goods, and it doesn't generate a large demand or supply of public goods. So I think that mechanism, for example, is one of the reasons why we find this 20%, which is a sort of small number. And it's also true that you have these dictatorships like China since 1978 that have promoted economic development. So that's another reason why the effect is small, because in this bin of autocracies or dictatorships, you actually have some big success stories. So I think one way that people talk about this, which I don't agree with, you'll see why, is to sort of say, oh, great, so what we need is we need to get Lee Kuan Yew, we need to find a good autocrat. That's the thing, So there's some evidence on this about, leaders and the effect of leadership. This is work by Ben Jones and Ben Olkin, who looked at transitions in economic growth caused by the death of leaders. So at the top left-hand corner, this is, Chairman Mao dies in 1976, was it? And you can see there's a distinct transition in China. The trend in GDP per capita goes up, slopes up after he dies. Okay. On the right, let me see, the thick black line is when Samora Machel, the president of, so if I look at Mozambique, the thick black line is when Samora Machel dies in a plane crash. You see that after 1975, when Mozambique becomes independent from Portugal, there's a very severe economic decline. But when Samora Machel dies, that sort of turns around and there's positive growth. There's positive growth after that. So these can go. These are examples. The Guinea example, this thick black line, is when Sékou Touré, the post-independence leader, also passes away. And so these figures show, leaders matter in the sense that leader deaths, which is a sort of, you could say, an exogenous event, are definitely associated with large transitions in economic growth, both positive and negative. It turns out it's not necessarily positive. It's positive and negative. But so you could sort of say, okay, we just need to find a good autocrat, but I don't think that's a very useful way of thinking about anything. I think what the more useful way of thinking about it is, are there cultural aspects of politics that we're kind of missing to understand this situation? Meaning, I think, I started with this intuition that, unless political leaders or political elites are sort of constrained by institutions or guided by institutions, they're always going to have their private interests at heart, and their private interests are going to be inconsistent with what's in the collective interest. Okay, and that's a dominant, that's a sort of hegemonic tradition in Western political thought. It goes all the way back to Aristotle's Politics, maybe even before that. If you look at the Spartan constitution, if you look at, Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus and his account of the origin of the Spartan constitution, it's not so different. There's this idea that if you give people power, they're bound to misbehave. Okay, in Aristotle's terminology, monarchy always degenerates, sort of the rule by one person, a kind of autocrat, always degenerates into tyranny, and that's the worst sort of government. Okay, so that's the hedge. You can trace that. You can trace that idea through the kind of the Roman constitution, Roman notion of republicanism, through, the Italian city-states, Machiavelli, Montesquieu, James Madison, you name it. That's the dominant idea in Western political culture. But it's also obvious that other parts of the world don't have that same idea at all. Take China. So how to think about China? Well, one way to think about China, which I think is interesting, is to say, okay, there's an autocracy, but there's always been an autocracy in China. There's absolutely no history of accountability, of the sort that you see in many other parts of the world, not just the Western world, but in India. India has very deep history of accountability and democracy. You know, according to some historians, India, you know, the India at the time of the Buddha, for example, you know, in North India, had highly democratic participatory political institutions. So democracy is not a Western invention. I'm not saying that, and I don't want to be understood as saying that. You know, it's like agriculture. It was invented many times in many different places by humans. But I think here I'm emphasizing a particular kind of Western tradition of how power is thought of, and this concern of the abuse of power. And, you know, I always like to contrast that with a passage from The Great Learning, which is one of the sort of great Confucian classics. And here's the model, you know, here's Confucius's model of good governance. Their thoughts being sincere, their hearts were then rectified. So everything starts from you and kind of self-improvement, you know, rectifying yourself. Their hearts being rectified, their persons were cultivated. Their persons being cultivated, their families were regulated. Their families being regulated, their states were rightly governed. Their states being rightly governed, the whole kingdom was made tranquil and happy. So, you know, the famous image in Confucian philosophy is, you know, it's like a stone is dropped in a pond and then the ripples spread out. So if we all rectify ourselves, that will ripple all the way up to the level of the state, and the state will be rightly governed. Okay, so here, you know, it's a completely different model of how the state works in the collective interest. Okay, so I think a lot of the work that Professor Acemoglu and I have been doing the last 5 years is trying to understand in a much more serious way political culture and how political culture may be influencing this kind of heterogeneity. I think that's the way you could think about it. Okay, so I, you know, I think so, you know, I don't want to talk too much. So let me just sort of say, and I certainly don't want to talk about India, though I'd be absolutely fascinated to have a discussion about, you know, how you think about this in the Indian case. Is, you know, perhaps this literature on democracy and growth, good, you know, there's evidence, there's empirical evidence, and I try to give you a particular take on that, which is to say, it's not completely wrong, the intuitions we have, you know, that, you know, what would happen in Zimbabwe if it democratized, or what would happen in Venezuela if it democratized. But it's clearly only capturing a part, you know, of the variation. Where else is variation coming from? I think quite plausibly it's coming from political culture. I've been working, you know, for the last 25 years in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to end with an African example. But I think in my experience in Africa, political culture is enormously important, you know, in explaining this mapping from, you know, from the decisions of elites to collective provision of public goods, or, you know, and you know, and in a sort of non-institutional way. You know, I'll give you an example from Ife. So this is in southwestern Nigeria. This gentleman in the middle, you know, with the crown, he's got his hand up, you know, and he has all these, you know, this is the Uni, the so-called Uni, who's the king of Ife in Yoruba land in southwestern Nigeria, and he's wearing the so-called Are crown, the beaded crown, you know, which is associated with the emergence of the state in Ife in the late Middle Ages, probably what archaeological evidence suggests. So he's a sacred king, you know, in a very traditional way, you know, in the sense of James Fraser's book, The Golden Bough, if you know, one of the great classics of anthropology. He's a sacred king. He's a divine king who mediates between supernatural powers and deities and humans. But the organization of the state, the traditional state in Ife and indeed throughout Yoruba land, was very unlike Western states. In some sense, sovereignty stayed with the constituent kinship groups and lineages. There was an Uni here. You can see the Uni, but his role was that of kind of mediation and trying to keep, you know, harmony between human life and the cosmos. And, you know, to me, if I think about that, you know, we could think about he certainly has powers. He has lots of taboos surrounding him also. He rarely emerges in public like this. This is a special festival. but it's, you know, it's not like the Chinese Communist Party, and it's not like the United States presidency either. You know, it's a very different cultural context, and I think you have to see the politics as involved in, you know, as embedded in that context. And in fact, one question I've been asking myself, I work a lot in Nigeria nowadays, is like, is there even politics here? You know, like we have in the Western world, we have this idea of politics. If I tell you, you know, politics, then I say to my colleagues, politics, they know what that means. But it's not even clear to me that there is politics in this case, you know. So I think that's, for me, that's the big political agenda. We seem to have really under-conceptualized differences in political culture in the world. And I think maybe that's a key to understanding the facts that I started with. So let me stop there. Did I manage to stop sharing?
So, Surjit is there. Should I start speaking?
Yeah. Ashima, yeah.
Surjit, can I go ahead?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Robinson. That was really interesting, the anthropological view and the role of culture. So I think the idea of unpacking local institutions and political culture is really important. And before I'll try to apply it to the Indian case to see how I think it can apply here, and I think it can, I'd like to see that your econometric work, because I am an economist, maybe, you know, we talk about leaving out outliers. So both India and China are really large countries. And when we talk of this debate, dictatorship versus democracy, it often comes around to who is doing better and who is likely to do better in the future. So, you know, if you just drop these two countries, or maybe weight your countries by population, you might get some interesting impacts on how democracy itself works without these two large sort of elephants in the room. So coming to India's history, and as you were saying, the Buddhist councils, and in some sense, democracy was very deeply ingrained in the culture. And so that might explain why, because at the time that we got independence from the British, the papers were full of, you know, those unwashed, illiterate hordes invading, because India had very low percentage of literate participants. We had full, you know, 100% vote power of voting. So the idea, the Western press felt that Indians' democracy would just collapse. It could not last. But it has lasted all these years. When many of our neighbors, the army took over or other things happened, democracies did not really work there. But we have had regular elections. We have had, you know, the incumbents losing power, etc. But your other thesis about how that when the mass has power, then the public goods or what happens is in the interest of the masses. That did not happen in India for a very long time. And the reason might be India's heterogeneity, that we have, you know, we could be divided by caste, poverty, of course, communal so politicians were able to create vote banks and give these kind of handouts which kept people voting for them without really providing them economic equality and public goods. But, you know, currently I'm traveling in Kerala, you know, which is a very currently also it has a very leftist government. And the other complication in India is we have a federal structure. We're a huge country, so we have almost 30 states and union territories, and each has a very different political culture. And when we compare India and China, I think China was able to decentralize. They had a very strong central government, but they decentralized to the provinces, and there was competition, and they really provided economic goods. But in India, that decentralization has been inadequate. So at the third tier, there's very little political power, and that is the part of government that is closest to the economic, to the individual, and is responsible for many of these public goods. And there's also confusion over who is responsible for education, say, and so on, between the center and the lower level. But what really works is voter pressure. So being in Kerala, where the talk very often mostly used to be about redistribution and education and etc., a hospital, but this taxi driver was telling us that we don't have adequate public toilets. So as you reach a certain level of per capita income, he's saying our planes are working, airports are wonderful, but trains are still not in a good condition. So the voters now want public goods. Another puzzle in India is why women's participation is very low compared to many, even the Middle East countries and the Mughal culture where women used to be veiled, etc., etc. But recently, women's participation has increased. And there's a whole debate about is this properly measured or it's because of poverty, etc. But actually, I saw a socialist study which says that after household income crosses a certain threshold, below that, women withdraw from the working force because they are comfortable, the household is comfortable. But as it crosses this threshold, then they want to develop their own careers and they go in. So we've seen maybe India has crossed that threshold, and we'll see both voter pressure for public goods and more participation in the economy from different gender or caste or states, etc. Yeah, and pressure for more decentralization of political power. I think I'd stop there. I'd like to hear your reactions to these. This is really trying to apply your ideas to understand India's situation.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Robinson and Ashima. And I like now to open up for some questions. Before that, I have a question of my own, a couple of them. One, there's a quote in your presentation: democracy empowers those with the biggest interest in public good provision. End of quote. But what happens when the deep state is concerned more with private goods and welfare? The second point is one that was made by Prime Minister Maloney just yesterday, and this is the conflict that we are now seeing in democracies, in the West in particular. And she said that she wants a movement to save Western civilization. So, some comment by you as to what is going on, the turbulence in democracies. We know about the turbulence in non-democracies that happens, but is this a new phenomenon, or is this a continuation of something old? You had mentioned about culture, and to what extent does this have to do with the big, massive movement of people across different cultures? And so how might we envision the future in these democracies and in others? And then I've taken some notes on the questions being presented on the side over here, but I'll hand it over to you now for preliminary comments on both Ashima's and mine, and then we'll go to the rest of the questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think the democratic history of India is sort of fascinating because it's so inconsistent with this kind of modernization idea, which I've never believed at all. But I think when you read the history of India, you see there's such a deep kind of history of democracy as a kind of political institution. It becomes not so surprising that India has sustained democracy since 1947. And I think but you're right that this hasn't created mass provision of public goods, and part of the reason, I would say, you identified yourself, which is what I was calling clientelism. That the Congress Party, in its old days, had a kind of political machine, and that mitigated against the provision of public goods, even though there was democratic pressure in some domains. And I also think, this, something in the Indian case, which was kind of latent in my discussion, is that I think what we understand now is that there's very important interactions between democracy and somehow the capacity of the state, or I think the problem in India also is that, to transform society, you have to have a state, you have to have state institutions that are kind of capable of doing that. And I think that's a big part of the problem, for example, in many Latin American countries, where you can even have governments that are sort of well-intended, but their ability to actually do anything is limited by the lack of capacity of the state. And I think also in the Indian case, and this is something to kind of link both of your comments, it seems also like part of the problem in that, again, this is very much missing from the work that we did, or most mainstream social sciences, the kind of ideology, that in the sense that post-war India sort of committed itself to this particular socialist model of developing the country, which was extremely well intended, but didn't turn out so well as a model of economic transformation and economic prosperity. I mean, I think, when I was a student in the early 1980s, we were still being taught, that Soviet Union had a great growth model. And I think that took India some time to kind of disentangle itself from socialism and that socialist model of development that didn't generate the resources necessary to really transform poor people's lives in India. And I think, in some sense, that's what's going on now in the world today. I think it's very difficult for me to think about what's happening in the United States without thinking of this ideology. Like, I think what you see at the moment in the United States is, the President Trump and and his advisors and his team, are pushing a very ideological agenda. There's different ideologies at play. One is a very libertarian agenda, meaning they think the state, the government is evil, basically, and the government can't do anything good. And if the private sector can't do it profitably, then it's not worth doing. So this downsizing of the state I see as being very ideological. I don't believe that's happening for a minute because Mr. Musk wants to sell Tesla cars to the government. No, it's not. It's not happening because of that. And it's not clientelistic either. In Venezuela, if you look at the transition in Venezuela in the first government of Hugo Chavez, for example, yes, they fired a lot of people from the government and they replaced them with their friends and supporters. That's not happening in the United States. In the United States, they're just firing everybody, So I see that as being very ideological. So I think, and I think when the Prime Minister of Italy, is talking, that's also reflecting, I would say, ideology in the sense of, this is a legacy of nationalism, of European nationalism and the nation state, this idea that the state has to be built around a national identity. That may be something very different in India. I'm not a scholar of India, but I think that's something which has caused enormous problems, in world history in the last 150 years, I would say, including world wars. But, it's very powerful, that ideological drive, so she sees, Italian national identity as being threatened by migration, by other kind of factors, and I think what she thinks of as Western civilization is this Western national idea of identity, but you could say that's another ideological aspect of the theory that's kind of missing. I don't know about this issue of the deep state. That's sort of fascinating. I don't think there's very much research on that in social science, to be honest with you. I was trying to think about, when you mentioned it earlier, what's the best research to my mind on this? And I don't think, mostly nowadays the research is about developing state capacity and problems of state capacity and different theories of the variation of state capacity in the world, like the incentive or disincentive to create state capacity. One really, one rarely hears anything about this issue of the deep state, which is sort of fascinating because President Trump is obsessed with it, for example. But I can't really think of any social science on that topic. Actually, it's really interesting, and I'm not even sure what my opinion. There's a very interesting recent book by Michael Lewis, by the journalist Michael Lewis, about like how the government works in the United States, which is sort of the opposite. I mean, he portrays the government as being full of like serious, well-intentioned, hardworking people who are really underappreciated. There's a lot of work on corruption, on how clientelism undermines the functioning of the state, but the deep state is somehow the state takes on a kind of autonomous agenda, and perhaps it's just a research topic that people have underestimated. And I'm not sure I really have that much of a view on it, to be honest.
Thank you very much, Professor Robinson. And the deep state is. I had written a piece on how the deep state exists in India. So it's not just the US. But anyway, I want to turn over to questions. I have Manuela Dan, who has, can democracy stay inclusive and competitive without losing ground to authority and efficiency in a technology-driven world? And perhaps, Charan, should we ask the person to ask that question? I'm just reading it off the board here.
Hello.
Actually,
Sir,
I also have a question, but I leave it to your discretion, whatever you prefer.
Yeah.
Sir, may I ask a question?
Yeah. Manuela?
Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Sir, this is Professor S.B. Yadav from Alwar, Rajasthan.
Yeah.
I want to ask a question from both of the distinguished professors. That some time back, I participated in a seminar in Germany on development and democracy. So, the participant from the China said frequently that they are the largest democratic country and they have the best democracy in the world with regard to the development. Whereas I defended India's democracy and development. So how do you see both of the democracy and their relation to development? This is my humble submission, sir.
Should I respond?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think this issue of technology and, this very rapid technological advances we're seeing at the moment in artificial intelligence, what are the consequences of that for political institutions? I think your guess is as good as mine. I think, the way I would think about this is, why is democracy in our empirical work associated with more rapid economic development? Well, democracy tends to create more what I would call inclusive economic institutions. It kind of spreads economic opportunity more broadly. It tends to create a kind of more level playing field, and that's good for innovation, and it's good, for innovation in all spheres, including in artificial intelligence and technology. I don't think it's a coincidence, that it's the Western countries that are leading in artificial intelligence, and particularly the United States, of course, in this technological revolution. That's because of its democracy and relative inclusion. Of course, China has also been doing well in that domain, but the Soviet Union did very well in some domains, in weapons, and they put the first dog and the first man into space, and so the Soviet Union did very well in some domains where it put a lot of resources, and China is extremely large, and so it's put a lot of effort into this AI, innovation, and it's been very successful in that domain, So I think the big picture is still, what's the feedback from that onto political institutions, which is more your comment. I don't know the answer to that. I think in our book Why Nations Fail, we're very clear, in saying that in any inclusive society, there's always incentives to make the society extractive. We give the lead example is Venice. Venice was possibly the richest part of the world in the late medieval period, but the institutions were completely undermined by a kind of elite-driven coup d'etat, who then, made the very economic institutions that had made Venice rich illegal to kind of stabilize the society. So could that happen in the United States? Of course it could. Yes, it could happen anywhere. This is the, so is that going to happen? I don't know. Yeah, hopefully not. But I think, like trying to understand what the consequences of this technological revolution for the sustainability of democracy. I think democracies can certainly stay ahead, through that mechanism that I identified. But is this going to feed back and kill democracy? It's certainly leading to enormous concentration of economic power that's spilling over into the political domain, because all that wealth can be turned into political power. It can be used to buy elections, which is what's happened in the last 6 months. And, is democracy stable in that situation? Maybe not. Your guess is as good as mine about how that goes in the next few years. On this question, Professor Yadav, on I don't think China is not a democracy, on any criteria that social scientists use to assess democracy. And India is a very successful democracy. So I don't quite understand the Chinese gentleman's point of view.
Hello.
Can I ask the question?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. Then there was hello.
A very good evening to all of you. I'm Ankita, a research scholar from Punjabi University, Patiala. My question to Professor Robinson: how we protect democracy before democracy protect our institution? For example, recently we see that in the case of US freezes $2 billion funding to Harvard. There is threat of freedom of expression in US. Immigrants and students are deported in most inhuman way. So in light of these incidents, how we can protect the democracy? Like we are expecting that democracy protect our social institution. But I believe that in contemporary times, democracy itself in danger. So I want to know, Professor Robinson, that how we can protect the democracy.
I mean, I could answer that. I said at the start, there's many mechanisms. If you read Aristotle's Politics, when he discusses democracy, he didn't like democracy very much, and he didn't like it for exactly the reason that you're identifying, which is, it leads to, what he would have called demagoguery, I guess. The demagogues were famous in Greek history, in Athenian history. So I think, I think what you have at the moment is, these issues like nationalism have become extremely salient. They've been used as a kind of political ideology. There's other ideologies, at work, as I said, kind of libertarianism, and there's an anti-liberal ideology also. I think the attack on there's a massive attack on a kind of social liberalism. This idea that you're sort of free to do whatever you like. If it doesn't impinge on anybody else, a kind of what you might call, what Isaiah Berlin would have called negative liberty. You're free to change your sex, for example. Okay, there's an enormous backlash against that. Okay, in a typical liberal society, you sort of say, okay, if you want to change your sex, change your gender, then you can do that, and it's not affecting anybody else. But now that people are saying, that's not right. Okay. So that's an attack on social liberalism. I think the universities are seen as a kind of bastion of the liberal establishment, and the government sees that as a threat to their ideological agenda. So they're going to try to shut them up. And so Aristotle would have been quite happy to say, this is the problem with democracy, and of course, that's in some sense why we construct all these institutions, checks and balances and constraints and separation of powers. But I think what we see at the moment, those are not working very well. For example, the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court has no enforcement power. Why is that? Because at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, there was a lot of discussion of the Supreme Court and the role of the Supreme Court in evaluating the constitutionality of legislation. But that never got into the Constitution because they couldn't agree. And it was only afterwards, in the famous Madison versus Marbury case in the early 19th century, that the Supreme Court took on this role. So that was never in the Constitution. It took on the role. But because it took on the role, there was no enforcement mechanism stipulated. So now you see there's a bug in the Constitution. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is how on earth did it take 220 years for that bug to show up? And I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. There are a couple of more.
Sir, this is Ramesh Kumar, sir.
I have
This is
a
Ramesh
question.
Kumar from Alagappa University, Tamil Nadu. Sir, this is
Sharon,
Ramesh
can
Kumar.
you just stop people just intervening? How do you want to handle this?
Sir,
Sir,
Hello?
Bhalla sir, I would request everybody, please write your question in the chat box. Then Dr. Bhalla can choose which one to ask, because the time constraint is there. Professor Robinson has kindly agreed. There was already a time confusion in the beginning. So we will have to be very selective. Professor Robinson, how much time more would you have for us?
Can we do another 10 minutes or something?
10 minutes. So I would leave it to Dr. Bhalla to decide, requesting everybody to please write your question in the chat box.
Yeah. Thank you, Charan. So I have a question here from Mr. Bose, who is, the question is related to what we've been discussing. So he discusses China and other non-democracies, and has this following question, that why not the best policy is to follow communism with an open economy, if I understand that right. So in other words, you have control and you have open economy.
I didn't mention the word communism. I'm not sure it has much to do with communism, what's going on in China. I think it's much more deeply sort of cultural, I think like what's or historical. I mean, I think like what's fascinating about the Russian case, for example, think about what's been happening in Russia in the last couple of decades since President Putin consolidated his power. It looks much more like pre-Bolshevik Russian Empire than it does anything to do with communism for me. It's like the political goals, are very similar. And so I think it's more deeply historic. So I think when I think about China, I think it's much more cultural, the model. President Xi endlessly quotes Confucius, for example, and I think that I would take that seriously. I think they've tapped into this deep culture in China. And there's lots of aspects of that are very interesting. China was the only part of the the pre-modern world, for example, that selected its elite through an exam system, as a massive examination system. They created this enormous mechanism of meritocracy in China, which is also extremely historical. Like even Confucius talks about you should promote the worthy. So that's a very powerful culture, in a capitalist system, it turns out, So I wouldn't think of it as being communist also. I don't see anything left of communism in China. And I think, like my own work in Africa, I think communism is an interesting thing. I think many colonial African leaders, for example, they didn't talk about communism. They talked about socialism. They talked about African socialism, and they talked about how socialism was a kind of model, for society, which was rooted in African culture, collectivist culture, but perhaps was an axis to unify many different ethnic identities and cultural linguistic identities. It didn't work terribly well. But I don't think that's the secret to what's going on in. That's not the way I think about China, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay. A last question, and then and this relates to the U.S. and what's going on there, which is being followed with great interest around the world. There is this attack on universities, which I think most people are very, very unsympathetic towards. That is, they are unsympathetic towards the attack on the freedom of universities. A secondary issue, and I'm not so sure what this just came up yesterday or today as to how to think about this, and would love to get your views, that should NGOs be financed by public capital, which they are, but also should public funds be used to finance and support NGOs? So, in other words, making a distinction between universities and NGOs. So the question is more interesting question, I think, is on NGOs that in the political system in the US with your PAC system and all that. That's an NGO, but that's completely financed by the private sector. So my question is, should NGOs be financed, allowed to be financed by government?
Well, I think welfare economics or public finance provides an answer to that, which is, yes, they should be, or potentially they should be if they're doing, an activity that generates positive externalities in society, or which is solving some problem of like market failure, or, I do think we have a kind of systematic way of looking at that. So I think it all depends. There's no blanket answer. It all depends on what they're doing. No, I mean, that's the way I would think about it. I think, the argument for subsidizing universities is, there's an awful lot of basic scientific research that has enormous positive effects for society, for technology, for all sorts of things, and the government is trying to encourage that basic scientific research. I think that, probably Elon Musk, and President Trump's idea is, as I said earlier, well, if something can't be done by the private sector, it's not worth doing. But I think public finance is all about how that's not true.
No. So anyway, my question was NGOs as distinct from universities. I think I believe there's universal agreement on the kind of public goods that universities provide. I think there's a lot more debate on the kind of public goods that NGOs provide. But I'll turn it back, but thank you very much, sir. And I'll turn it back to Charan Singh to close the session.
Thank you very much, sir, for chairing the session. And I want to also thank Professor Ashima. I know she is traveling. The date had moved a number of times, and she still agreed to be here with us. And Professor Robinson, of course, indebted to you for this. I must share, listening to you, and especially your slide on maybe a false issue, where you spoke about the great learning. I was reminded of research by Professor Robert Barrow at Harvard when he moved from economic growth and started looking at the role of religion into growth. And I must share this with you. While doing my own postdoctorate studies with him and otherwise in the Western world, I've always wondered, law used to play a very important role. But in a country like ours, and I've moved from small cities to the biggest in the country, I can share with you that the law and discipline has basically been maintained because in my childhood days, about 10 days a year, we would be exposed to good literature played out on the streets of our country. And for my Indian audience, they would play out Ramayana. Good ideal king, good ideal citizen, good ideal wife, good ideal brother. All those things would be played out in front of us every evening for about 10 days a year. And rest of the time, there are people thinking about it, contemplating about it, waiting for it. And I used to think the Indian democracy, the Indian discipline is basically in the formative stages, at least of mine and my generation, came from those. Whereas in the Western model, law played an important role. But in the Indian model, and going by that slide of yours, it was the good citizen which threw up good local leaders, which threw up good ethical, responsible national leaders. And so the democracy continued with its strength and the discipline continued. And I think the labor, everything was so contented that they would continue as good, responsible citizens. That played a very important role. And that slide of yours and Robert Barrow's research, and of course my own work on sociology, which shows that quite a bit of growth did take place when the Protestants and the Catholics, the difference came, the Calvinism that you and yeah, so that made a very big role. I must thank you for a very thought-provoking research that you have shared with us today. Many of us on a Good Friday evening, about 150 of us were glued listening to you, and many more, of course, are going to be listening to this on the weekend when they come back from their long weekend and the holidays. So I must thank you from the depth of my heart for spending this time to be with us. Professor Robinson, as I mentioned earlier, we are indebted to you. I'm also thankful to the participants who have still not been able to stop asking questions because the talk was so good, everybody could understand, and the issue very close to our heart. Are Indians democratic institution? If China says they are democratic, then I don't know what Indians are and what Americans are. But then one thing is sure, democracy seems to be a good word and everybody wants to be following democracy. Does it lead to growth? According to Professor Robinson, this is the most favorable thing for growth. He has given examples to us where it is non-democratic and there could be, could not be. But I think the lesson we have is the democracy that we have in our country and in our countries, America and India, need to be really treasured. It is something good. And within this democracy, we need to grow and we can grow. With that, let me thank each one of you, the professor, the chair, the discussant, and the participants being here with us today. This PowerPoint and this discussion will be available on our website tomorrow by noon. Next Friday, we are discussing, in view of the trade wars, the role of trade agreements. And we will have a civil servant and an academician talk to us about the role of trade agreements and the role that they have played in India in the past, and then what it can do for us in the current situation. Once again, have a great weekend. See you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.